This story originally appeared on The Athletic, the best place to read about football online. Visit theathletic.co.uk/Tifo Football for a 7-day free trial and 50% off an annual subscription. Jörg Berger had not been allowed to accompany the GDR under-21s team he was coaching to a game in the West since December 1976. That month, the authorities had found out that he was about to divorce his wife, Harriet. Single men were considered a flight risk. Berger was told to move back into the Leipzig apartment he'd shared with Harriet and their young son Ron if he wanted his travel privileges reinstated, but he refused. The former Lokomotiv Leipzig player also rejected an offer to become one of the 174,000 informal collaborators the Stasi ran until the fall of the regime in 1990. In March 1979, Berger was at last permitted to go with the junior national team to a match in Subotica, Yugoslavia, but the Stasi were still nervous about him defecting. They broke into his apartment to search for clues that he might be planning his escape. He later read in his file that they'd made a drawing of the regular route that he drove to see one of his girlfriends near Berlin. The situation became especially fraught when BFC Dynamo player Lutz Eigendorf, one of the most highly rated East German footballers, defected to the West 5 days before Berger's under-23s were boarding their plane. The Stasi were under huge pressure to prevent any more famous athletes fleeing, but he decided that he had to take the chance regardless. Like thousands of fellow citizens who attempted to escape the economic hardship and political repression in the GDR each year, Berger had long dreamt of a better life over the wall. He needed to be free. In Subotica, Berger left the team's hotel at 5 a.m., took a train to Belgrade and sought help from the West German embassy, who issued him with a fake passport. A huge manhunt was underway. All newspapers carried the story. Berger was even recognized by a border policeman just before crossing into Austria, but he was let go and arrived in Munich a few hours later. My father had committed a crime against the state and was now considered a traitor, his son Ron Berger said, sitting in a cafe in Frankfurt 40 years later. But I didn't have much of an idea what all that actually meant as a 9-year-old boy. Was he out of my life forever? Family members of GDR deserters were also discriminated against in their work life or even in school, and those who knew about the flight in advance could go to prison. Well aware of those dangers, Jörg had been careful not to incriminate Harriet or Ron. My mum didn't know, Ron said, but she felt something was going on, especially when he visited us for the last time before heading off to Yugoslavia. Harriet was brought in for lengthy questioning. The Stasi alleged that she'd been tipped off about Jörg's intention to defect to the non-socialist economic area, as the GDR referred to West Germany, but ended up believing her account. Ron doesn't remember anyone treating him differently at school at first, but in the following weeks, strangers would come up to him and ask whether he was in contact with his father in the West. He was, but only intermittently. Jörg only phoned every 3 months or so, and the calls had to be pre-registered 2 hours in advance. I sat by the receiver, waiting for the phone to ring, a bag of nerves. My father wasn't able to explain himself to me, and I didn't feel free to talk either. There was crackling in the line. You knew the Stasi were listening in, and we couldn't relate to each other as father and son anymore. Following Jörg's defection, the state auctioned off his belongings to raise funds for the monthly alimony of 120 Ostmark, worth about 20 West German marks on the black market at the time. Via friends or family, Jörg would secretly send his son gifts, a set of coloured markers, bars of chocolate, a pair of trainers, but Ron could never show those to outsiders. Jörg was hired as coach of Zweite Bundesliga club FC Darmstadt in May 1979. During his next job at SSV Ulm 1846, he proved himself an effective firefighter, avoiding relegation to the 3rd division. He eventually came to be seen as an expert in lost causes. Bundesliga sides Eintracht Frankfurt, FC Köln and Schalke 04 all escaped the drop under his energetic guidance. Jörg Berger is such a good coach, he would have saved the Titanic too, Norwegian striker Jan Åge Fjørtoft said after he helped Frankfurt stay up for a second time in 1999. Throughout the 1980s, the Stasi continued to regard him as an enemy of the state. GDP agents followed his every step in West Germany. Once, 2 men approached him in the street late at night and warned of dire consequences for his parents, who still lived in Leipzig, if he didn't agree to meet his mother in Sweden. But why Sweden? He sensed that they were planning to kidnap him. After the fall of communism, his Stasi file revealed that there had indeed been at least 2 attempts to get him back to the east. Once, a wheel came loose as he was driving at high speed, another, his tyres were slashed. For a while, he slept with a gun underneath his pillow. And he became very ill in 1986. He was unable to walk or pick things up. Doctors diagnosed polyneuropathy, a disease affecting the peripheral nerves, and he recovered after a few months. A university professor who looked at his case later on suspected that he'd been poisoned by lead or arsenic. And of course there were attacks on his reputation too. His file showed that the Stasi had a journalist working for Kicker magazine spread a rumour that Berger was a homosexual, which was taboo at the time. Ron Berger kept pace with his father's career watching the class enemy TV stations of West Germany. Almost everyone did, flouting the law. In his flat, the terrestrial aerial was positioned near the door so it could be quickly hidden when unknown visitors arrived. Growing up in the GDR, it was normal to support 2 clubs, says Ron. You had your hometown club, Lok Leipzig in my case, and a Bundesliga side. Most were fans of Bayern Munich or Hamburger at the time, but I chose Eintracht Frankfurt. At GDR top division games, kids and teenagers would meet outside the ground and trade Western fan memorabilia. Scarves, stickers, badges, posters, magazines that had been smuggled in on the black market. He and Harriet lived in a socialist megablock of apartments containing 85 units on each of the 10 stories. Fast and agile, Ron played for the youth teams of Lok Leipzig, the same side his father had represented in the late 1960s. He was widely seen as the biggest talent of his age group in the GDR. Just like his father, Ron stretched the yellow shirt's long sleeves until they covered his thumbs. The resemblance was uncanny. The way I played and moved reminded many of my dad, Ron recalled. I had apparently inherited many of his mannerisms. It got to the point that my mother felt that she had to get involved. She walked up to the fathers of the other players and asked them to please stop all of those comparisons with my dad. But there was no escaping the stigma that clung to his second name like a clump of mud. He was never made captain, never got called up to any of the youth national teams. Travelling abroad for matches was out of question too. Then his victimization became more obvious. In 1985, Lok Leipzig under-15s were playing a game to entertain a crowd of 80,000 in Leipzig Zentralstadion as a warm-up for a GDR versus France World Cup qualifier. Ron was already inside the stadium when he was told that there was no point in him getting changed. They explained that it was impossible that Berger should appear on the scoreboard. I was the son of a traitor. And soon after, his fledgling football career was over for good. Lok Leipzig kicked him out. You have your father to thank for that, their president said. My dream of becoming a professional died that day, Ron said. It would have been too embarrassing and too risky for the GDR to see me, of all people, turn into one of the country's elite players. And school became a problem as well. Ron wanted to stay in college to do the equivalent of his A-levels. His grades were good enough, but he was turned away. In the summer of 1989, the Iron Curtain was twitching. 50,000 GDR citizens fled to the west via Hungary, Czechoslovakia and Poland. And Jörg and Ron agreed to meet in Prague. And with the help of a politician who sat on Eintracht Frankfurt's board, Jörg secured a diplomatic passport, an insurance policy in case the Stasi was still attempting to repatriate him. Some people recognized the Eintracht Frankfurt manager and asked him for autographs and photos in the street. I couldn't quite deal with the situation and hardly spoke a word, remembers Ron. Back at the hotel, he unpacked a suitcase full of gifts, shirts and memorabilia from Frankfurt, but I hadn't come for presents. All I wanted was to meet my father, to get to know him. It felt more as if I had won a weekend with a Bundesliga coach in a competition. After the wall came down 5 months later, Ron moved to an apartment not far from the home of his father. Little by little, my son started trusting me again. It simply took much longer than I'd thought, Jörg wrote. He himself needed another 20 years until he could publicly acknowledge that his family and friends should have been more important to him than the glory and success that he'd sought for selfish and superficial reasons. And some were able to adjust to the new realities in the reunified Germany much quicker. Jörg was outraged to find Wolfgang Riedel working as a treasurer for one of the German FA regional federations in 1991. Riedel, a former GDR FA official, had been a communist hardliner and responsible for organising the manhunt for Jörg after his getaway from Subotica. Another man, a Dr. Jörg had last seen handing out all manner of colourful pills to his GDR junior team in the mid-70s, had become the German FA's official anti-doping commissioner. He also uncovered that two of his closest friends had spied on him for many years in service of the Stasi. One of them, football coach Bernd Stanger, until recently the manager of the Syria national team, had agreed to set up a meeting with Jörg with a view to getting him back to the GDR. "They plan to abduct me," Jörg wrote in disgust. Of course, there's a Stasi file for Ron too, but he's never been tempted to read it. He doesn't want to delve into the past for fear of unearthing some unpleasant truths about friends, teammates, teachers, or coaches. Jörg passed away in 2010, aged 66, after an intermittent 7-year battle against cancer. His father's death led Ron to reassess his own life. He had founded and run a very successful sporting goods company, but had neglected himself and his family for decades in the process. To find a much healthier balance, he sold the firm a couple of years ago. The 30th anniversary of the wall's fall has brought about a renewed interest in Jörg and the footballing aspects of the Cold War in Germany. A theatre play about him was staged in Frankfurt recently, and Ron is pleased that people still admire him as one of the Bundesliga's most charismatic operators, especially in Frankfurt, even if his own memories will continue to be coloured by the events of March 1979. The script for this video, written by Rafa Honigstein, was originally featured on The Athletic, the best place to read about football online. Whether it's more behind-the-scenes stories, dedicated local reporting about your team, or rich storytelling from around the world, you'll find it all in one place. So, if you like today's story, get a 7-day free trial by visiting theathletic.co.uk/Tifo Football and get 50% off if you sign up for an annual subscription. To support Tifo, support The Athletic. Thanks for watching.